This video has English and Vietnamese subtitles. Please click the CC button to turn on the caption. This video is meant to be viewed by you and all those who still don't know much about the case between the two YouTubers, Philip Dong and Phạm Định Quốc Vương, or we can call them by their YouTube names, Phil Dong and Vương Phạm. This video was made on November 3rd, 2022. In this video, I'm going to tell you the story about how one guy manages to fool many people into believing he is a multi-millionaire, and how one lone YouTuber managed to put a check on this charlatan millionaire. First, I'd like to give a brief introduction as to who these two YouTubers are. Phil Dong is a YouTuber from Canada who mainly makes videos talking about people and society, while Vương Phạm makes videos about travel reviews and entrepreneurial endeavors. Although the two never knew about each other, Vương Phạm was doing so many things that were of dubious authenticity, which many viewers found those to be a sore in their eyes. When so many people got astonished by how blatant some of Vương Phạm videos were, this brought to the attention of Phil Dong, who was said to be one of the Vương Phạm most fearsome moral rivals in his life. I am one of Phil Dong's viewers in Japan, and I have been watching his channel for well over a year. During this time, a supposed conflict began between Phil Dong and Vương Phạm. In this video, I'd like to explain things that Phil Dong might have omitted while describing the course of events to you. This video does not intend to prove that Phil Dong is innocent, or Vương Phạm is guilty, or any of the sorts, but to clarify certain points of events of this case from the perspective of a viewer, with the hope that it may help you to better understand the case between these two individuals in question. Everything started when Phil Dong made his first video about Vương Phạm on November 2021 as a result of continuous recommendations from his viewers who believed that Vương Phạm was being dishonest and untruthful in many of his YouTube videos at the time. In his video, Phil Dong expressed his doubts about the title millionaire that was associated with Vương Phạm and explained that Fastboy Marketing's Vung's company business model was outdated and unpragmatic, therefore could not be lucrative enough to make Vương a millionaire. He also expressed doubts about the scope of Fastboy Marketing, which claims to have over 200 employees, while in fact may only have a few at best. Phil's source of material in his analysis was a Vietnamese newspaper written about Vương, and Phil pointed out the contradictions between what was written and what could be seen in real life regarding Vương. At the time, Vương Phạm had already made a name for himself on YouTube as a self-declared successful Vietnamese millionaire in the US. His YouTube channel already had a reasonable number of subscribers, and newspaper outlets from Vietnam occasionally wrote articles to compliment Vương Phạm as a successful entrepreneur, which is of doubtful authenticity. The key point in this case that I'd like to emphasize more than anything is that, while Phil Dong was making analysis videos about Vương Phạm, he would always repeat that the claims he made in his videos were supposed to be speculations only, based on facts, and the only people who can investigate the truth about Vương Phạm is the authorities such as the FBI or the police. This fact is very much glossed over by Vương Phạm party. After the first video, Phil would upload one or two more to add new details to his analysis in the previous videos. During that time, Vương Phạm had reported Phil's videos to YouTube on the grounds of baseless accusations. Somehow, YouTube took down two of Phil's previous videos about Vương Phạm, which surprised Phil since his channel had always been reported by the government of Vietnam, and no one had ever successfully had his videos taken down. However, believing in his right to freedom of speech and that he was complying well with YouTube's community guidelines and rules, he dismissed YouTube's decision of removal and requested a thorough review. On careful examination, YouTube decided that Phil did not violate any rules that constituted a removal, and thus resumed his videos to normal. I can conclude from this fact that Phil did not make any defamation regarding Vương, and all he did was make an analysis. From then on, Phil made more videos talking about Vương and his deeds. Throughout December 2021, January and February 2022, Phil would point out contradictions in one of Vương Pham's video where Vương showed his viewers how he bought a private jet or how he bought a piece of land for investment. Phil checked the websites and found out that they were still on sale, proving that Vương Pham couldn't have bought them. Once again, it is implicitly understood that this was, too, speculation. Vương Pham also had certain expressions and statements in his video that contradicted the facts presented and even contradicted himself. Vương made too many contradictions that it would be ludicrous not to point out. One such example was when Vương Pham was taking a tour around a plot of land that he said he bought. He met an American man, and even though they seemed to not know each other, Vương blatantly told his viewers that the Westerner was one of his employees. The American man showed signs that this was the first time they had ever met, and he was clearly confused as to who Vương Pham was.
Nhiều tiền có thêm cho con mua nữa. Đây, anh Lân ơi, ông này là kỹ sư gì vậy anh Lân? Wetland hả? Hey, my name Vương. What's your name, sir?
Wayne.
Wayne.
Wayne Crouch.
Wayne Crouch. Anh cần cầm quay giùm tụi em xíu đi. Quay ông với em ha. So you are the wetland engineer, right?
I'm a wetland delineator, yeah.
Ok đó, thì hồi nãy là có nghĩa là ông mới giải thích cho Vương là nói chung là Vương cũng không biết tại sao Vương mướn mấy ông này, lần đầu tiên Vương gặp mấy ông luôn á, thì là mấy ông nói là đất á, mà nó có nước, nói chung là đất wetland là đất.
Since YouTubers can make speculations and analysis which are based on facts, at that point, I still believe that Phil Dong did nothing wrong. Vương Pham was also seen to be involved in the scam scandal together with Khoa Buc, a famous YouTuber from Vietnam who just came recently to America, and Johnny Dang, a renowned jeweler based in the US. The drama, which was talked about by Phil Dong, involved the three joining together to create and promote the DBZ coin to the Vietnamese population. It was estimated by some that the three raked in several hundred thousands of dollars before crashing the coin altogether, making the coin virtually worthless. Now that the investors were losing money, fearing for their safety and reputation, the three formulated a story about how there was a misunderstanding among them, where Johnny Dang was the one who was to blame for everything that had gone wrong. Of course, it was believed that it was just a strategy of the three to end this deal in the safest way possible, because Johnny Dang never goes back to Vietnam, while the other two, Khoa Buc and Vương Pham, often go back to Vietnam, which could make them vulnerable to threats from people who were tricked into buying the DBZ coin. That's why it was assumed that Johnny Dang was made a scapegoat for the safety of the remaining two, ending the deal by underhanded means. In this scandal, although at first most thought that Vương Pham played little role, later it was revealed that Vương Pham may have been responsible for creating the DBZ coin in the first place, because Vương was seen employing short-term IT engineers from Vietnam, even though his business model does not require that many IT engineers at all. The source code for the DBZ coin can even be found on GitHub, an online repository for hosting open-source programming projects. The DBZ coin turned out to stand for Diamond Boys with a Z, and Boy is implicitly understood to represent Vương Pham's Fastboy marketing company, indicating Vương major role in this scam scandal. During the same time, Phil also commented that Vương Pham is of communist origins, since Vương Pham already made it public that he was born in Củ Chi, an infamous hiding spot of Viet Congs during the Vietnam War, and that his grandparent, Nguyễn Văn Đực, was a Viet Cong who sacrificed in the Vietnam War. This is, too, a fact delivered even by Vương Pham himself. Phil would also upload videos of himself reviewing arms and guns on his channel, frequently commenting that he was showing off his possessions to the communist cows from Vietnam, and was in no way referring to Vương Pham whatsoever. Phil Dong also made videos commenting on some of Vương Pham's construction projects, which Vương uses as a means to attract investors from Vietnam. Phil Dong said that Vương Pham's project had yet to be approved by EB5 Immigrant Investor Regional Centers, which can be checked on the said website. This means that Vương Phạm was recruiting EB5 investors for unapproved, non-existent construction projects, which very much violated the immigration laws of the USCIS. Once again, this was also an analysis and a call for attention to possible fraud, not conclusive accusation. After many repeated failed attempts at reporting Phil Dong's videos to YouTube for removal, Vương Phạm began to consult an attorney and sued Phil Dong in a civil case. Vương Phạm stated in one of his videos that he sued Phil for defamation and threats. This claim was factually seen to be false, since Phil was not making any accusations, as he was making no more than analysis, nor was he making any threats to Vương Phạm family. Vương Phạm also filed false claims to the FBI about how Phil Dong used guns to threaten the safety of his family, which is again untrue. Vương was also seen posting Phil Dong's house address on social media and asking his followers to come and visit Phil Dong, which violated privacy laws. Vương also shared a video not of his own channel that made false accusations against Phil on how Phil came to Canada with dirty money he gained from espionage as a Chinese spy, which is again untrue. Vương said that he found that video by chance on YouTube and would like to share to inform people about who Phil Dong is. However, that video was remarked by Phil Dong, once again, to have been possibly forged by Vương Phạm and his group, since the channel that the video was published was very new, with very few followers, and the time the accusing video was published was very close to the time Vương Phạm found it and shared it online. For a really new channel to get its video up to the top search, it would take a really long time until it is found by more people. The fact that Vương Phạm found the video so early and easily could be explained by the possibility that Vương Phạm and his group made that false accusation video themselves. The video was promptly taken down, possibly by Vương Phạm and his group, for unknown reasons. Likewise, Vương Phạm and his group were constantly making threats against many other YouTubers who were talking about him and exposing his possible fraud and wrongdoings. Vương Phạm and his group were reported to have employed methods such as sending threatening emails, threatening phone calls, and virus links that can track the clicker's IP address to the disagreeing YouTubers other than Phil Dong. This proved that Vương Phạm and his group were very belligerent and were undoubtedly having something extremely shady that they didn't want to be exposed to the wider public. Their actions were also extremely covert, taking predatory actions behind the scene against disagreeing YouTubers, while on the front, Vương Phạm said nothing about the allegations that were thrown at him at the time. To fund the legal case with Vương Phạm, Phil Dong set up a GoFundMe account. However, since Phil saw the fees would be very high and prohibitive, and even if he won, he would have little to no gain from the battle, he stopped suing Vương Phạm and stayed on the defense instead. The case went on for a period of time for the first half of 2022. Perhaps due to Phil's exposing videos with damning evidence, Vương Phạm seemed to apparently upload videos at a slower rate, and the contents of his videos were getting a little bit more honest than before. Phil Dong also gave hints at Vương Phạm possible connections with the communist officials from Vietnam, and how Vương Phạm may have been assisting in bringing in yield-gain money from Vietnamese communist officials, thus effectively aiding international money laundering. Phil gave this theory because Vương Phạm was seen to buy houses that were worth millions of dollars in cash, which is virtually impossible for Vương Phạm, and one of Vương Phạm employees, Mrs. Li Lê, is a daughter-in-law of some high-profile communist official from Vietnam. On July 2022, Phil Dong went to America and visited one of Vương Phạm non-existent construction projects that Vương Phạm was using as means to recruit investors from Vietnam. It was clear that Vương Phạm did nothing as he said he would do the year before, as the land was still undeveloped when Phil came there. During Phil's visit to America, he was welcomed by a pho restaurant owner, Kevin Nguyen, who revealed that Vương Phạm had already attracted many investors from within America and Vietnam, and had received real money for the fake construction projects that Vương promoted the year before. This shocked Phil because all he made was just speculations, and now stories of Vương Phạm scamming people starting to emerge from numerous sources. From July to October 2022, Phil continued to raise awareness and bring attention to Vương Phạm possible illegal practices and wrongdoings. During this time, Kevin Nguyen started a Change.org petition to request the U.S. government to promptly open an investigation case into Vương Phạm and many of his companies in light of all the suspicions of criminal activities as follows. First, Vương Phạm was shown in one of his own videos confessing to the possession of over 10 million end users' personal information through nail and hair salons' credit cards machines, including credit card information, and Vương made clear his intentions to extract money from those credit cards. Second, Vương is suspected of his major role in the production and promotion of DBZ cryptocurrency in a scam scandal, together with Khoa Buck and Johnny Depp. Third, Vương is suspected of money laundering through buying up exorbitant real estates and all in cash, highly likely for high-ranking Vietnamese government officials to legally own real estates in America. Fourth, Vương is suspected of making fraudulent PPP loan application under one of his corporate names known as I Buy Beauty LLC. Fifth, Vương is suspected of practicing the illegal sale and apparent advertisation of immigrant visas, such as E-26, EP3, and EP5, to offshore Vietnamese workers and investors. Sixth, and the most serious of all, is the suspicion of real estate syndication scam carried out by Vương and his people through 4 non-existent construction projects, as Vương Phạm was seen raising capital openly on his YouTube channels. The petition currently has nearly 4,000 signatures at the time of this video. Somewhere in late October 2022, Vương Phạm and Phil Dong supposedly met at court, and possibly due to the request of the court, Phil claimed that he would resign from the drama, and he went on to hide and delete all of his past videos talking about Vương Phạm. Now Vương Phạm was seen recently making false claims openly on his YouTube channel about how Phil misused his GoFundMe donation for different purposes. And Vương also said that Phil is a coward who would not dare to confront him in court, which was again extremely subject to suspicion, because Vương Phạm lawyer, according to Phil's confession in one of his videos, employed many underhanded means and tactics to make it difficult for Phil to attend courts or hearings, thus making him effectively not obeying the court's demand for attendance. Vương Phạm and his lawyer were condemned by Phil many times because they employed many underhanded means to undermine Phil Dong, and how they were not trying to win this legal battle fair and square. Before I conclude this video, I just want to say that now that Phil has already taken down all of his videos regarding Vương Phạm, this video may be one of the last ones to condemn Vương Phạm and his actions. The US and Canada are countries that highly value the freedom of speech of their own citizens, and I wholeheartedly believe in those values. Regardless of the outcome of the case between Vương Phạm and Phil's previous allegations against Vương Phạm still stand, and they deserve a serious response from the US government, and urgent action should be taken to investigate Vương Phạm and his group. Thank you for your listening, and I hope you all have a nice day.